Welcome to another installment of Donning the Armor. This morning we will begin in Genesis chapter 41, verse 17. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Behold, in my dream I stood on the bank of a river. Suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt. Such ugliness I have never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the gaunt and ugly cows ate up the first 7, the fat cows. When they had eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were just as ugly at the beginning. So I awoke." So he's saying, normally you eat something, you get full, you get healthy because you're eating. But he's saying you wouldn't even have known because there's no change in them. They are just as gaunt and ugly as they were in the beginning. So also I saw in my dreams, and suddenly 7 heads came up on one stalk, full and good. Then behold, 7 heads, withered and thin and blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 good heads. So I told this to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do." Once again, dreams are connected. You woke up, went back to sleep. God reiterated his prophecy to you. Now, that's an interesting point. He is about to do. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do, what God is about to do. Ended last episode talking about how, good or bad, all things come from God. Now people will talk about the problem of evil. Well, then did God create evil? No. God doesn't create or cause evil. Evil is what happens in the absence of God. See, what's about to happen to Egypt, this 7 years of famine, which we're about to talk about, that is not an evil. That is a trial. Trials do not necessitate evil. They do not have to be seen as evil. They could be seen as very great blessings. It's something that people don't like to acknowledge, that a trial can be a blessing, or that a trial does not necessarily have to be for the edification of the person going through the trial. This is, get off on a little bit of a tangent. I try not to do that in this program, but speaking to my daughter, she was, we've lost some people, and she was saying it's not fair that this would be God's plan for this person. And I said, I get that, but sometimes God's plan for me isn't about me, it's about you. I said, if I got sick of cancer and I got better, we could all learn a lesson from that. If I got sick of cancer and I died, you could learn a lesson about that. And I spoke about Jim Elliot. And he was a missionary who was quoted as saying he would give his life for God. Well, he went to go to bring Christ to an uncontacted tribe. After a couple days of trying, those tribes murdered him and the people he was with. Murdered him in cold blood. You ask him, before that moment, this is God's plan for you. You're going to be murdered. These people will reject you and murder you. Do you think Jim Elliot would like that plan? My daughter said no. I said, okay, well, let's complete the story a little bit more. Jim Elliot has a young daughter. Jim Elliot has a wife. His wife becomes a missionary, well, was a missionary too, but she becomes even greater missionary than him. She goes to that same tribe years later and converts them to Christ, brings them to Christ. She goes on to be a prolific author and missionary. Elizabeth Elliot is one of the most well-respected missionaries there ever was. Now, Jim Elliot's in heaven. God reveals this is the plan for his life. That his murder, his death, wasn't about him, but was about the edification of his wife, his daughter, and the people to follow. Do you think Jim Elliot's happy with that plan now? Yeah, probably. Just because a tragedy and a trial occurs doesn't mean it's evil. Doesn't mean that's the work of the devil, as if God has no part to play. Joseph is saying this stuff that is about to come upon us, this horrific trial, God is doing it. And we're going to learn why God did it. But God is bringing this about. He has his reasons. We just need to trust in that Jeremiah 29:11. And look, I get that verse is actually Jeremiah screaming at the people of Judah, basically. But it also has to do with the fact that we are to trust in him. It says in Isaiah 43:1, I have called you by name. You are mine. So because of that, we need to then flip to Jeremiah 29:11 and know that because he has called us by name and we are his, that he has a plan for our good, for our salvation, for our hope and our future, and we need to trust in it. If we are to have faith in him, that means we have trust in him. And if we have trust in him, we can't be trusting in ourselves and second guessing him. He is sovereign, but more than sovereign, more than perfectly sovereign, God is perfectly loving and perfectly just. And that is the part that we trust in. We don't trust in his sovereignty. We know his sovereignty. We have no say in his sovereignty because he's sovereign. We trust in his promises because he is perfectly just and perfectly loving. But continuing with verse 26. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are 1, and the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh that he is what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice because the thing is established by God, and God will surely bring it to pass. And that is the human condition. Not just about blessings. See, we go through blessings in trial. And so often we want to praise Lord in the blessings and shake our fist at him in the trial. But so much of our human condition is in what it just said there in verse 31. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following. 7 years of abundant blessings will be forgotten, will not be known by the inhabitants of the land. They will not remember because of the famine to follow. Because of the trial, they will forget the blessing completely and entirely. It'll be as if it didn't exist at all. And we fall into it so often that when we face trial, we forget blessing. And we can't let it be that way. We need to be better because we know better. As Christians, we need to look at situations around us, unfolding around us in our country and our cities. And it's not just talking about our current political climate, but the climate to come. Things happen and cycle in waves. We're on a downturn as a country. Maybe we pull up out of that a little bit and we have a decade of success. It's happened before. It can happen again. But then as soon as that cycles back down to a downturn, then all of a sudden we forget. Our country right now, we are in a moment of forget. We forget how abundant things were in the 90s and in the 80s and even through half of the 2000s. And we look at the last 20 years and say, oh my goodness, this country's awful. It wasn't always that way. And it doesn't always have to be that way. But either way, it's to the Lord. Don't like the president? The Lord rose him up. Doesn't mean he rose up a guy to rule over us well. Sometimes countries are cursed with bad leaders as a punishment. Now, regardless of where you fall politically, you might think each of the last 4 presidents especially could be curses or blessings. I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to follow Christ. And I kind of ignore that stuff because of it. But anyway, verse 33. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this and let him appoint officers over the land and collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh. And let them keep food in the cities. Then the food shall be as a reserve for the land of the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. Great plan and great philosophy for life is to save for the future. To gather a portion for a storm, for a downturn. Because tough times will come, they always do. And if we keep a reserve, we will be more ready for that downturn when it comes. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this? A man in whom is the Spirit of God? So he's saying, can we even find anybody like this? Like this obviously is not coming from the mind of a man. This is coming from a Spirit of God, which to them, they believed there were dozens of gods. So they do believe that he has the Spirit of God about him. They just don't accept that it is the God. They think it's one of their lower G gods. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all of this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Joseph continues to walk closer and closer to the Lord. And the Lord continues to bless him in greater and greater abundance. He goes from being a shepherd, and not even a shepherd. I mean, he wasn't even the one tending the flocks most of the time. It was his brother. And then he goes to being a slave, to being the master of a household. The master's most trusted servant. Then he goes to prison, becomes the warden's most trusted servant. Now here he comes out of that to be immediately turned from in prison to being right hand to the Pharaoh himself. And only in the regard of the throne, in the ruling of the country, as a actual regal manner, is he greater than Joseph. Everything else is under Joseph's authority, period. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed them in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. That signet ring is significant because that signet ring is the seal of Pharaoh. Anything Joseph were to write and seal with wax with that signet ring means that came from Pharaoh himself. That carried the same authority as anything Pharaoh had written. And he had him ride in the second chariot which he had, and he cried out before him, "Bow the knee." So he set over him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." So he's saying, people can't even get up without you. People can do nothing without your consent. It's hyperbole. Kings used a lot of hyperbole back then, but he's saying this is how much authority you wield in my land now. That people may not even lift their hands or a foot in all the land of Egypt. That they need to stand perfectly still in your presence until you tell them they can move. So Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zephnath-Paneah, and he gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Now in the 7 plentiful years the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain, as the sand of the sea, until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. And to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and my father's house. And the name of the second called Ephraim, for God caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. So, now, as you can see, there's time before the famine came, 7 years of plenty. In those 7 years, Joseph is made to have authority just under the Pharaoh. He is a wife. He now has 2 sons. He is being blessed in so much abundance that he cannot contain his joy for the Lord. He names his kids after praises to the Lord. That the Lord has made him forget his toil because he's been so blessed. That the Lord calls him to be fruitful in the land of his affliction. He named his kids to praise the Lord. That's how righteously he tried to walk in the way of God. Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come. So Joseph had said, the famine was in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do." So it wasn't just Egypt this famine was going over. It was through the surrounding lands. Everywhere was under this famine. But they had prepared. And when they cried out, he said, well, go to Joseph. Whatever he says, that's what you're going to do. The famine was over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. Now, there's some consternation over whether this means the actual earth, or is this the known world, so to speak, to the Hebrew people? Is it the Middle East? Is it the Near East? Or is it the whole earth? Don't know. Either way, the Egyptians aren't selling the storehouses to the entire earth. So in that way, we're only dealing with the surrounding areas as far as this story is concerned. Whether it is over the entire face of the earth, that's something we will not know this side of heaven. We'll figure that out when we are reunited with the Lord. And the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain because the famine was severe in all the lands. So Egypt became the hub for everyone's food. everyone all around, that became where they needed to go, is to buy in Egypt, because Egypt knew it was coming, and they were the only ones who knew enough and were prepared enough because they took time to prepare. As I said, you don't need to know tragedy is coming to prepare for tragedy. We should make that preparation anyway, as best we can. You don't go and spend your entire paycheck on fun stuff and then go, hey, where's my rent money? Or, hey, my car broke down, I don't have any money. Well, if you take time to save, you're more in better position to be able to survive on what you've saved. In some cases, the trial is harsher than you can deal with. In this case of Egypt, since it came from God, they are in perfect position. But moving on to chapter 42, verse 1. When Jacob saw that the grain was great in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" And he said, "Indeed, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy for us there, that we may live and not die." So now we return to Jacob. Remember, this whole section with Joseph and being sold into slavery started out with the beginning saying, this is the story of Jacob. When most of the time this story is dealing with Joseph, but it's about the creation of the nation of Israel and the tribes and where they fit and are blessed further. So here we return to Jacob, return to the brothers, and he's saying, look, I've heard that there's grain in Egypt. Why are we looking around, staring at one another, starving? You need to go down there and figure out and go buy food instead of trying to figure out on our own how to survive. So Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt, but Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, lest some calamity befall him. And the sons of Israel went to buy grain among those who journeyed, for famine was in the land of Canaan. So they're not the only ones going. All these tribes and cities and peoples of Canaan are also going down to Egypt to go buy grain, to go try to buy, that way they can sustain themselves with the bread they make from it. But he refused to send Benjamin. He lost Rachel's one son. He's not going to lose his second. And once again, we still see that Jacob would almost sacrifice his 10 other sons to save the sons of Rachel, who was his preferred wife. Now Joseph was governor over the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the earth. And here we see the dream becoming reality with the sheaves of grain. He dreamed of wheat sheaves, and now here we find them looking to buy wheat sheaves of grain from Joseph, bowing their faces to him, just as God had predicted, just as God had prophesied would happen. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he acted as a stranger to them and spoke roughly to them. Then he said to them, "Where do you come from?" So they're not going to recognize him because he looks like an Egyptian at this point. He will dress like an Egyptian. He will have the same makeup and hairstyles, and he will look like an Egyptian person to them. And they haven't seen him in 20 years. And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." So Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. Then Joseph remembered the dreams which he had dreamed about them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." So he's trying to say, you're spies. You've come to see our secrets, the nakedness of the land. You've come to see what we try to hide under our clothes, basically. You're trying to find our secrets, take them back so you can come and invade us. And they said to him, "No, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food. We are all one man's sons, and we are honest men. Your servants are not spies." Now they're terrified because, one, they're trying to buy food to feed their family. Two, because they know this man has authority over them. He has power over them at this point, power that they fear that he'll wield against them. Because if you're spies, you're being put to death. But he said to them, "No, but you have come to see the nakedness of the land." And they said, your servants are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And in fact, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no more. So saying, look, we're 12 brothers. Our youngest is still there, and our other brother died. But Joseph said to them, it is as I spoke to you, saying, you are spies. In this manner you shall be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you and let him bring your brother, and you shall be kept in prison, that your words may be tested to see whether there is any truth in you, or else by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. So he put them all together in prison 3 days. So once again, here we see Joseph letting his anger and his bitterness get the best of him in this moment. We are seeing that, no, he is not sinless. No, he is still a human being. These people treated him horribly. They did terrible things to him. And now he is taking a big step, because by saying by the life of Pharaoh, he is saying on Pharaoh's life. They consider Pharaoh to basically be God. So this is a vow that is incredibly serious for Joseph to make. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here, to send one back, and he's going to keep the rest in prison. And if you don't do it, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you're spies. He is swearing upon Pharaoh, basically, his life, that they need to do as he said. And the reason is because he doesn't trust that their youngest brother is even still alive. He doesn't trust them to have not mistreated him in the way that they mistreated him, or mistreated Benjamin in the way they mistreated him. Now, we'll see as we go through Scripture in the coming episodes that how this goes through and how this unfolds. But it is not beyond any of us to fall to the worldliness and the sinfulness of our nature. We are only righteous by the grace of God. God sent his Son because he loved the entire world. He wishes for none to perish. Salvation for only those who trust in him. And because of our bitterness, because of our anger, so often we refuse to place that trust in God. We refuse to see what blessings and abundance he has for us. And in this moment, Joseph is failing to get past the bitterness that has now been brought forth into his life, brought back into his life by the presence of his brothers. He remembers the dream, but he doesn't understand the dream. Remember, the interpretations didn't come from Joseph. He had 2 dreams he told to his family years and years and years ago, but even he didn't understand the interpretation of them. He's seeing them unfold. He's seeing his brothers come bow down before him. But he's not seeing the interpretation. That his brothers, that he is in a position of authority over them as a savior of them. That this is what God had promised. That this is what God was showing him. Sometimes God shows us things and puts us in a position and nudges us to where he wants us to be, and we don't know why. We don't know for what reason. We don't understand until it's revealed in its fullness, and we go, oh, that makes sense. But trust that that time will come, because it will come for Joseph too in the coming chapters. And his whole family will understand what God was trying to tell them in the beginning. But in this moment, he doesn't. And it's not a slight to him. It's not a fault to him. It's something we just as humans do. But know that when the Lord tells us something, we don't always understand it fully, but we will understand it in time, in His time, which is perfect. All right. Thank you for joining me for another installment of Donning the Armor. Hope this was fruitful for you. I hope to see you again next time. But until then, be blessed.